Welcome to Understanding Islam, the Big Picture. Today we reach week 6. What can we say about God? Just to remind you, first of all, that you're very welcome to send in questions for our next question and answer session. Send them in by email to the address below. And also there's an article to go with this program that can be downloaded from my website. So, what can we say about God? The first thing we need to say about God is that God is one. God is one in two senses. First of all, God is perfectly unique. So God is not the biggest God or the God of my people. God is the one and only. There is no being like God. The second thing we want to say about God is that God is indivisible. You cannot have parts of God. This means that you can never say that God shares divinity with anything either created or uncreated. In fact, the greatest sin of Islam is the sin of shirk. This is to give God partners, to worship something else alongside or in addition to God. We're told in the Quran that this is the one sin that God will never forgive. Now, God is one, and God alone demands our worship. Therefore, this rules out not just the worship of idols, tribal gods, the nature gods, the ancient gods of our people, but it also rules out the modern idolatries that people have, be it racism or worshipping money or power or ideologies. All these things are forbidden by the command to worship God alone. But God does not just want our belief, our statement of faith. God wants our action. And so the believer is required to put this belief in the worship of God alone into every aspect of daily life. The job that I do, for example, am I worshiping God or am I worshiping something else in addition to or alongside God? So every action, every aspect of life must be brought under the worship of the one God alone. Islam always has difficulties about the use of human language when talking about God. Except the problem is that the only language we have is human language, and God uses human language in the Quran about God as well. So we're told that God sits on a throne. We hear of God's hands, eyes, and face. We hear that God speaks and sees. Now, some Muslims have understood these to be metaphorical references to the power of God, to the knowledge of God. And others will say, no, God in some way does sit on a throne, does have hand or eyes, but these are not like the human eyes and hands that we have. The Quran also speaks of God in more philosophical and abstract ways. God is all perfect. There is no imperfection in God. God is all-knowing. There is nothing that is hidden from the knowledge of God. God is all-powerful. There is no other source of power other than the power of God. Now that means that even the power that I use to do a wrong act is God's power, and I am misusing this good power of God. God is also outside of time, eternal, beyond the confines of time. God alone existed before time existed. Time is one of those things that God created. In the same way, God is beyond the constraints of space. God is not a material being like me. I cannot be there and there at the same time because I am limited by my physical nature. God is not limited in this way. This means that there is nowhere that we can say that God is, and there is nowhere that we can say that God is not. God is not bound by the concept of time. What then can we say about the essence of God? Precisely nothing. In God's essence, God is unknowable. Technically, we would say ineffable. We cannot make any positive statement about God in God's very self. All that we can do is to speak as well as we can within our limited knowledge and categories. God is beyond all our categories, or as we might say, transcategorial. One of the ways that the Islamic tradition speaks about this is to say that God has 100 mercies, and God sends one mercy to the earth to suffice the whole of creation throughout all ages, and keeps 99 in reserve for the day of judgment. Now, what this means is that if it were possible that we could actually understand the whole of the quality of mercy upon the earth throughout all creatures and all ages, we would know 1% of the mercy of God. So the nature of the mercy of God lies beyond our capacity to understand. When we speak about God, we have to use the language of analogy, because we do not have the categories that will stretch into speaking of God in God's very self. Let me try to make this clear by the use of a two-stage example. Step 1. Let's take a category that we do have, the category of foot. Now I can say, my foot is on the end of my leg, and we know perfectly well what that means. But I can also say that at the weekend I'm going to go walking, and if the weather is good, I'm going to walk to the foot of Mount Snowdon. Now, mountains don't have legs or feet. It's clearly a different kind of statement. And yet you know where I'm going. I'm not going to the summit of the mountain. I'm not going halfway up. I'm going to the foot of the mountain. And so we can transfer the category foot from the foot at the end of my leg to the foot of the mountain. It conveys knowledge. Now we're going to take our second example. And this is more difficult, because in this one, we're going to take an example in which we do not have a category to share. Let us take the example of a human being who is born blind. This person has never seen anything. Therefore, this person does not have the category of color. Our task is to explain the color scarlet to this person. The way we're going to try and do this is to use another category which the person has. In this example, I'm going to use the category of sound. So let's begin this way, and you can do the experiment with me. Think about the color scarlet. Now, it's not crimson, it's not cherry red, it's not poppy red, but it's scarlet. Now think about the associations that the colour scarlet has, not visual, but other kinds of associations. What would it mean if we said she was a scarlet woman? Or if we said she walked into the room wearing a scarlet dress? Now, keep that idea of scarlet and those associations in your mind, and let's think instead of the category of sound. Imagine if we took our person who was born blind down to the household cavalry, where they have a great group of trumpeters, and they blow one of those raucous, blaring fanfares of trumpets. Now, try to hear it first of all in your ears. What does it sound like? And then try to think, what kind of non-aural associations does the fanfare of trumpets have? The way that it feels, the way that it makes you shrivel inside, cringe back. Now, if you put that alongside our category of colour, can you see that there's a little carryover, just a grain of carryover from the colour scarlet to a fanfare of trumpets? Just a small grain is enough, because that's where we are. We do not have the categories as human beings to speak about God in God's very essence. That means whenever we say something about God, we are talking a fanfare of trumpets, and God is talking scarlet. So our categories do not pass over into the categories of God. Therefore, God remains essentially unknowable, and all our language about God is the language of analogy. Now, if that's all that there was to say about God, God would be a very cold character. We could say this is the ice-cold God of the philosophers. You cannot have a relationship or a closeness with this God. But the Quran has another tradition too, and it speaks about the immanence of God. It says that God is near to those who call upon God. And in another verse it tells us, God is closer to the human being than our jugular vein. Now, I find it interesting that the Quran does not say God is closer to the human being than his little finger, because I could imagine going through life without a little finger, but I can't imagine going through life without a jugular vein. That is so intrinsic and intimate to me and to who I am. My lifeblood flows through my jugular vein. Without it, I cease to be. And yet God is closer to me than my jugular vein. That's very close indeed. In order to have some words to talk about God, the scholars of Islam search the Quran and search the teachings of Muhammad to make a list of the names by which God is known, both in the Quran and in the Hadith. Now, of course, God is beyond our knowledge, therefore God has many more names than we can ever know. But there is a famous list of 99 names which are used by God in the Quran and which are used of God by Muhammad in his Hadith. These 99 names give us some insight, some God talk some knowledge of the qualities of God. So we're told, for example, that God is all-powerful, that God is eternal, God is the first and God is the last. God is the creator, the sustainer, the preserver, the giver of life, the giver of death, the one who raises up, the one who brings low, the majestic, the truth, the subtle one. God is the friend. God is the loving. God is the guide, the truth, the source of all wisdom, the source of peace. Now, all these names for God give us some ability to talk about God. They give us some characteristics or qualities of God that we as human beings can begin to understand and can seek to model our lives on. Now, prophets are the most exalted, the spiritually most perfect of all human beings. They are, as it were, like perfect polished mirrors in which the qualities of God reflect. And so we can look at the prophets and we can see these qualities or names of God that are made manifest in their lives, as though they reflect the quality of God as light is reflected from a mirror. Now, that is the process of spiritual growth through which all human beings are to go. One of the ways in which this is done is through working with these beautiful names. And so you will find that many Muslims will have in their pocket a string of beads like this. This is a tasbih, and it has on it 99 beads. And these, of course, correspond to the 99 beautiful names of God. So one of the things that a Muslim can do is to memorize these 99 names and then recite them. By reciting them, one is singing the praises of God, but one is also drawing them into one's mind, into one's consciousness, and seeking to model one's own life around them. Indeed, one can take one or a group of these names and meditate on them, perhaps repeating each one 100 times over, so that those names enter deeper within us. The Sufis have a very useful phrase here, which helps us to understand. They say, we are to color ourselves with the colors of God. We are to allow those qualities of God, of justice and mercy and truth and compassion and generosity, so to color ourselves that we manifest them in the world too. If a Muslim is to go along to his or her Sufi sheikh or sheikha, their teacher, and have a conversation about the state of their life and the state of their soul, perhaps the sheikh will say, you know, your trouble is that you're really a mean person. And what you need to do is to learn to become much more generous. So here's your spiritual exercise for the month. I want you to take the name of God, Al-Karim, the generous one, and I want you to write it on the mirror so that you see it when you wake in the morning, to write it on a post-it and put it on your computer screen, to put it on the dashboard of the car. I want you to take time to meditate on it, and I want you to take your tasbih and to repeat it 1,000 times over each day, so that you allow that name, that quality of God, to enter deeper and deeper into your being. And then come back and see me in a month, and we'll see if you need a repeat prescription. Another way in which the tasbih can be used is in saying short, repetitive prayers in praise of God. So one very common tradition is to say 33 times, all glory be to God, Subhanallah. All praise be to God, Alhamdulillah. And finally, 33 times, God is the greatest, Allahu Akbar. And Muslims are encouraged to do this often, time and again during the day, to raise their sense of God consciousness. And we see often people doing this after formal prayers. Another way in which the names of God are used as reminders of qualities to which human beings should aspire is in the very names that people are called. You may well have a friend or have heard of someone whose name begins with Abd. Abdullah, the servant of God. Abdul Haq, the servant of the truth. Abdul Rahman, the servant of the most merciful. Abdul Karim, the servant of the most generous, and so on. So the very name which is given is a reminder that one should strive toward that quality. Women are given names which are formed in a similar sort of way as a derivative of the beautiful name of God. So we might find someone who is called Salma, from peace, Karima, from generosity, Aziza, from the all-powerful one, Nur Allah, from the light of God. This is similar to the way in which in an earlier English culture, girls would be given one of the great virtues for a name in order that they would strive toward it. Grace, hope, charity, faith, prudence. You can see that having this name gives you something to live up to, something toward which to strive. And there must have been many grandmothers in an earlier generation who would have said to their granddaughter, "When are you going to live up to your name, Patience, my girl?" Join us next week when we are going to talk about the life and times of Prophet Muhammad. I hope to see you then.